Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar, Capturing the Next Generation of High Net Worth Customers. This webinar will explore the evolving needs and preferences of younger investors and provides actionable strategies to build lasting relationships and future-proof your business. We thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Tracy, a Director of Business Development here at Bank Director. This webinar is brought to you both by Bank Director and Wealth Access. An information resource to the financial community since 1991, Bank Director focuses on the strategic issues most fundamental to a bank's CEO, senior leadership team, chairman, and independent directors. Wealth Access is an enterprise customer data unification platform that works with existing books and records to generate hyper-personalized banking and wealth management experiences and insights. Its platform unifies data across business lines, improves customer loyalty, and drives revenue for 200 plus customers with over $571 billion in assets. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. We encourage you to stay engaged throughout the webinar. If you have questions for the speakers, click the Q&A button on the right-hand side of your screen anytime during the presentation. Our speakers will address your questions from there. This presentation will be shared with all attendees within 24 hours via email. It will also be available on bankdirector.com. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the Q&A button to let our team know and someone will assist you promptly. Finally, the opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the individual speaker only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the other speakers or of the entities with which the speakers are associated. On that note, let me introduce our speakers today. David Benskin is the founder and CEO of Wealth Access. Prior to founding Wealth Access, David acted as first vice president of investments in the Global Wealth Management Group of Merrill Lynch. He was a partner of a private banking and investments group team, then later launched his own practice at Merrill Lynch, providing wealth management advice to high net worth families. Miles Milton is the chief wealth management officer at Hancock Whitney Bank. Miles leads a team that delivers comprehensive wealth management solutions for individuals, families, and institutions. Miles' team provides integrated investment, fiduciary, advisory, and private banking services, all designed to help clients achieve lasting financial success. Guided by a client-first philosophy, Miles and his team partner closely with clients to create strategies that build long-term confidence and success. And finally, our final speaker today is Melissa Jackson. Melissa is the marketing director at Wealth Access, and she will be moderating this conversation. So with that, Melissa, David, and Miles, please take it away.
Thanks, Catherine. David and Miles, thanks for joining us today. And thanks for everyone who's on the line. So today we're going to be attempting to explore two sides of a huge opportunity for financial institutions. The first being how to attract millennial clients. How do we engage them? Do we do it now or wait until the wealth transfer? And then once they inherit, how do we retain and serve them? How different is that from prior generations, things like that. So there's a lot of numbers that float out there in terms of the projections of what they will be inheriting and what that timeline looks like. But that's really not just a shift in the wealth, but it's a shift in expectations, technology, and values. So today we're going to have David and Miles exploring that, and not just the shift for those who are inheriting the wealth, but business exits, right? Succession and family businesses, and kind of that broader migration of who's responsible for the bulk of the wealth today. So as Catherine mentioned, please feel free to drop the questions in the chat and we'll talk about them as we go through. So first, for Miles, as Hancock Whitney is thinking about the massive transfer, are you looking at it to treat it as a different sort of distinct strategy and initiative, or integrating that across your whole business strategy? How are you guys looking at that today?
Yeah, so thanks, Melissa. It really is a comprehensive point of view, and this has been on my radar for a while. And really where it started was probably 6 or 7 years ago, and that seems like a while ago, but we were faced with in the industry for financial advisors is between 2010 roughly and 2022, 23, the number of financial advisors in the industry was the exact same. So while assets had grown, the number of people coming into the industry were flat. It was moving between different channels, between banks, RIAs, wirehouses, but it was the exact same. And so that doesn't bode well when you know that you're getting ready to go into retirement. I'm at the edge of the baby boomer generation. And when I started to look at the numbers, which have most recently come out, I knew retirements were going to start coming into play. And so if you look at the latest statistics, and I'm just talking financial advisors alone, within the next 10 years, 37% of the financial advisory force, the workforce, actually exits. Just at the time when all this money is coming into the system to transition. And so that really was a wake up call for me. And then there were several reports that came out with both McKinsey and Cerulli that really magnified the scope of how large this transition is and what the downstream effects are from your employee base, your business owners. So we really put a strategy around it. We started it in wealth management, but quickly partnered with my colleagues that run the consumer bank as well as the commercial wholesale bank, because it affects all of us. And if you look at most of your institutions, my guess is your average depositor is probably sitting at about 57 to 59 years old. And so we all have to start thinking, what are the products and services, distribution channels, technology, employees that we're going to need over the next few years to begin to capture this transition. And it's not just millennials. I have several millennials. I have several Gen Z. They'll eventually get the money. My wife and I keep telling our kids, they're going to be skid marks in front of our tombstones. So don't expect the windfall. But at the same time, we're obviously planning for them to inherit money. But most of the millennials won't start getting that money until probably the 2040s. There will be some that get it through GenSkip Trust and things like that. But if you think of where most baby boomers are in the next few years, most are turning 70 years old. And with longevity increasing, it's going to be a bit before the millennials get it. So I just want to at least set the expectations for everybody on the phone. If you haven't done anything yet, there's no need to panic. There is a plan in place. So we are thinking about it comprehensively. You have to. And just for everybody's benefit, not only do I run wealth management, I sit on the bank's ALCO, the Asset Liability Committee, the Credit Committee, Deposit Loan Growth Committees. So I'm actually helping to run the bank as well. So we are looking at this in a comprehensive way.
As a millennial, I would love for that transfer to happen sooner and faster, but I totally hear that. David, from your side, you work with a lot of different institutions. I'm sure you're hearing the same, but we kind of talked previously too of, the wealth transfer and the inheritance. There's the component of the business side of it too. And, as Miles mentioned, 37% of the workforce kind of exiting that, right? And I imagine some of that is also transferring of businesses, right? So how do you kind of see that in the conversations you're having, in terms of their thinking of cohesive strategies across all these business lines?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And I hear you on the skid marks. Hopefully, there's not it's a slow versus a speedy spending of the money. But and actually, following up on one of Miles's comments, we're actually involved with the FinServe Foundation, and there was a stat that I think there's as many advisors over the age of 80 as there are under the age of 30. So it's an interesting demographic shift. And to your question, I think it's really a dual transition, not just of wealth, but also leadership, as Miles was speaking earlier. You've got baby boomer business owners who are going to sell or hand off their companies, while you've got next generation who's stepping into really the decision-making roles. And so for the financial institutions that we work with, we see it really kind of creates two client journeys for the exiting owner, the business owner that's potentially going to sell their business, or just some of the estate planning and other engagement models in terms of the acquiring or inheriting generation as well. And those really have a very different engagement model, right, in terms of how to approach them. And so what we're seeing is that the divide is pretty clear, that some banks are really starting to embed these next generation strategies into their core growth plans. And then others are still looking at it as more of a future issue. So, the more proactive institutions are shifting their metrics from how many accounts did you open, or, really more deepening the relationship, whether that's with the commercial side of their bank or the next generation of the families that they're working with. I think data is a core element of that, and really understanding, who's connected and who's really investing. So, it's not just a wealth transfer; it's a financial event if you look at it that way. And I think we're really at an inflection point that really will redefine loyalty in some of the relationships as these monetization events occur.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's a balance of, obviously everyone wants to grow, but it's also retaining what you have grown over time. And to your point, that's really two journeys to think about. As you kind of question for both of you, how does that impact how you maybe are shaping your 3 to 5 year roadmap? Kind of looking at that from client acquisition to enablement, right? Enabling advisors to help people exit, their businesses, or transferring their wealth to make sure their kids are set up for success. How's that impacting your, product roadmaps?
Well, it's not just product. I mean, it's distribution and staffing. So frankly, I started with staffing, and here was really the statistic that really put me into motion. So this came from a McKinsey study that indicated over the next 10 years, and that's more abridged since the study came out in 2023, women were going to control twice as many assets by 2030 as they did in 2023. And that number only grows more significant over time. So you really stop and take a look and say, what does your client journey look like today? Because if I've got nothing but a bunch of guys going in there talking to an audience that's going to be predominantly women over the next 10 years, that's a disconnect. And so we already had a very robust group of women and women in business events, and that was already an effort that we had made over the years. But I needed to double check that and make sure that the hiring alignment made sense there. The other thing is the age group. So, Melissa, you said you're a millennial. So as I said, I've got a couple millennials, couple of Gen Zs. I don't know about you, any of those of you that are parents, but you often look at your kid and it's like, how can you do those things? We didn't teach you that. And they look at things completely differently than when we do. I mean, just go back to when everybody bought GameStop because it was on Reddit. And so it's different financial literacy, which I think is really imperative for this next generation. But it's how they get the information. It's the trust in the information that, look, ChatGPT may generate for them, or Reddit may generate for them, a blog may come on TikTok. I mean, there are a variety of things that don't connect with me at all, but I've got to make sure that I've got people on my staff that get it, and that those are the future of the client-facing initiatives. But I will say product, and this really falls into David's category pretty significantly, is technology. So if you think in banking, just mobile app, being able to do everything on your phone certainly is key. You have to be able to do that. Being able to see all of your financial relationships in one place to simplify what you're doing is key. Again, that's how they're transacting the rest of their lives. So it goes back to the client journey map, products and distribution. But if you don't have the staff that's younger than the leadership group, thinking differently, if you don't have more women aligned in your client relationship management groups to meet where that intersection is going to take place over the next few years, you're behind.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you're really pausing to think of who do we have on staff, who can advocate and meet people where they are, just from an advisor perspective, but same thing on the tech side, which we will dive a little bit into those kind of habits, right? What's myth versus reality, and how has that evolved? So that's definitely very important. David, from the product side and kind of tech side of stuff, how is that kind of impacting what we're looking at and thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, to Miles's point, I think digital is obviously an important part of that. Really, regardless of generation, we're seeing from conversations with leadership of banks, it's also really engaging across the family or across generational relationships. Miles mentioned the demographics as well, really trying to connect with people digitally, but also the human side of that as well. It's the connectivity between data and human insight in terms of how people want to be, communicated with, and how from an advisory perspective, how you can really help them, from an overall advice through their entire journey, wherever that may be. And so I think it's really, from our perspective, what we're seeing is that the firms that are acting now are really reframing their technology and product, but it really, it's a bridge to connect the human side with data and technology to do that, to really, keep those relationships intact across generations as wealth is transferred.
Yeah, and I imagine, I would assume most of the banks on this call have thought about digital transformation, but now it's sort of that additional element, right, of next generations. Was your roadmap for digital transformation, does it have longevity, or how do you alter that with, kind of planning for these next generations? So certainly a very interesting time for tech within these community banks, regional banks, to kind of revisit those. So Miles, before we get into this next section, have you seen any early movement on assets beginning to shift and kind of, new conversations with clients emerging? Are they saying, hey, I'm thinking about transferring, or I've already done it? Have you seen any of those early indicators?
Not a lot yet, but what I will say, in the last 12 months, we've had several engagements on our private wealth side of the business, which for us are people that have $1 million in investable assets or more. And typically that means their net worth is higher, both from business owners and from C-suite level executives that are beginning to think about planning for the next stage. And we built our whole wealth management practice around advice. Well, we manage and administer $47 billion, so we certainly handle the investment side of it very well. But if that's all your conversation's about, then at the end of the day, you're just talking about returns and fees, and that doesn't really add value. So we spend a lot of time on advice. And what I have seen over the past few years, I said about 12, 18 months, is that either the business owner or the high net worth client is beginning to bring their children into these planning conversations. And that rarely happened before now. And so we're starting to see more of that. I can't say that it's a flywheel that's, hit its optimum spin yet, but it is a sea change, and we're starting to encourage that as well. And silent generation's a little bit different. They still stay, pretty close to the vest, and kind of share with the kids at the last minute what the plan's going to look like, or it may just be a surprise when you have to read the will. We still see quite a bit of that going on, but baby boomers, we seem to be a little more open to it, because one of the things we all want to do and we all recognize is money can change lives for the better or worse. And you see the best and worst in people when money comes into play. And so if you can begin to engage those clients and engage the families in those discussions sooner rather than later, and in some case have to put the trust in place to protect from some of those downstream effects. We're starting to see more in those conversations through the planning horizons take place. So it is something new that's happening.
I can relate to that. It's, my dad's finally trusting me with information in terms of finance. And, I think it's very valuable. I think my generation's eager to learn more about, what we need to be doing. And I think a lot of us here, financial advisors, something my parents have, but that kind of rotating of, well, maybe I should be involved in those meetings to know what that even looks like, is certainly really important.
Well, and Melissa, to put a point on that, another interesting statistic that comes out, and again, this one kind of shook the industry. When that money transitions, and it could be from spouse to spouse, so it could be a horizontal shift. And remember, I said the majority of those assets are going to transfer to women, just longevity issue primarily. But even to the next generation, statistics show over 70% will move financial advisors within a year of that happening. So for us, you ask early on what the advantages and what we're planning for. Well, most of that money sits with the wirehouses or registered investment advisors, folks who were with the wirehouses and have moved, who also have a succession issue out there. So we have really planned around that. But if you think about what you just said, that was a wake-up call for financial institutions saying, hey, if we may have Mr. and Mrs. Jones money, but we got to make sure that we're getting the kids. Let's ask the client if they'll invite the kids to the next meeting, because that's one thing a financial advisor wants to make sure is that those assets aren't going to go flying out the door.
100%. And we're ready to feel important as us millennials. So we're excited to be a part of it. So go ahead, David.
One thing just to jump in, and I think it's talking about that next generation. One of the things that's true is that that banks have the best relationships in their local communities. But sometimes at their core, they're commercial banks. And wealth management is a part of the bank and also the retail bank as well. But what we're also seeing within within banks as well is starting to work together internally across multiple business lines. So wealth with commercial banking or private banking, et cetera. And so I think there's back to the dual transition of wealth. There's also a very significant monetization event that's going to occur when that treasury, borrower, treasury management, that small business owner's going to eventually sell their business. And to Miles's point about wirehouses and RIAs, sometimes the first thing that business owner doesn't think about is their bank to manage their wealth as well. So starting to see where banks are working more collectively as a team to start to introduce wealth earlier on, to get ahead of that, to do exit planning or preparedness and really start to build a relationship so that those business owners that are going to transfer wealth or by selling their business or through inheritance, it creates a pretty significant opportunity. And they all know the Merrill Lynch's and the Morgan Stanley's of the RIA and their that they went to college with. So starting to see banks from a wealth management perspective start to get in front of those business owners is also a big shift that we've seen over the last few years as well.
Definitely. So we've talked about the transfer is real, kind of, some of the things you guys are already thinking about. And obviously everyone on this call wants to learn how to attract millennials and how to appeal, and not just millennials, but next generations. So we're going to spend probably the last, 20-ish minutes on strategy. But before we do that, kind of spending the time to say myth versus reality, right? Millennials are described as being tech obsessed, value driven, we're impatient, entitled, all of the wonderful things. But are they really that different from generations, right? And, kind of Miles and David, as you guys have seen, what are the things that are different, but also what are the things that are similar, right? And, kind of balancing those two things of you don't, as a community bank, you don't derail completely from who you were. How do you keep what you were grounded in and sort of appeal to those? So David, for you, in conversations with clients, do you feel as though clients truly understand the next generation and kind of balancing those, or they're still so stuck in designing for parents in terms of their behaviors of relationships to banks and relationships to advisors?
That's an interesting question. So there still are many banks that are designing, from the previous generation, right? Communications, product language, um, even digital design may reflect boomer preferences, really where the wealth is today. But what we're seeing, or obviously from a lot of research as well, is that if you think about millennials, Gen X clients, they expect more of a blend of self-service as well as human support. So they want autonomy, but they still value guidance, especially when the stakes are high and we're talking about wealth. So I think the more progressive firms are using data to really drive personalization to create experiences, but really understanding the life stage or where the clients are in terms of their journey, instead of really looking at it, at age alone in terms of, don't think that the reality is that they're going to reject advice, but it's less friction, right? They want to access information when they want, the way that they want to do it, but they still need advice.
Yeah, and to that kind of, Miles, you said something earlier about, the millennial trust, right? And next generation trust. How have you, kind of seen maybe some of your team succeeding in that? Like what tactics or what approaches have they kind of taken? You mentioned inviting them to the next meetings, right? What are some other ways that maybe they've started to gain some of that trust and momentum?
Yeah, so that's when you're dealing with, let's say, the boomer parents, and it's going to the next generation. You need to make sure that you're having those conversations. But I think offering things, and it doesn't matter how big a bank you are, you can do this, is offering seminars inside your branches to talk about how to plan for the future, how to invest. Because the one thing I will say with millennials and even Gen Z, what I see is a lot of engagement to invest. Because again, you go back and you look at some of the statistics. Most millennials, and Melissa, you can probably relate to some of this, but millennials and Gen Zs don't think Social Security will be there. There are really no more pensions per se. I mean, governments certainly have them. So there's not an income stream that they're relying on. So a lot of it's coming from private investment. That's their mindset. So they're more engaged to learn more. A lot of self-serve, what Dave said, just to cut the fees down. But I think what's pretty important is beginning to have those seminars. That's something everybody can do locally to do that. The other thing I'm going to mention really is probably the elephant in the room with banks. And that is, we are all clamoring for deposits so we can turn around and lend the money out. And when you talk about myths versus reality, there has always been this: whatever you do, protect the deposits and don't let it go to investments or somewhere else. We broke that voodoo, 10 or 15 years ago. And I will tell you, over the last several years, what I have seen, well, let's say a CD comes up for maturity and somebody wants a higher yield, and the bank's not going to pay that higher rate, and it gets referred into investments. First of all, we reflect that investment revenue back to the branch and back to that individual, so the branch isn't penalized. So from a revenue perspective, it's whole to them. But we found that when we did that, all of a sudden we got to look at other assets that we didn't know about that the client had at all these other financial institutions, because we were willing to talk about higher yield. So not only did we end up ultimately retaining those deposits, we actually grabbed more, not only deposits, but investments from the other financial institutions.
Very interesting. Yeah. And on the seminars thing, it's funny you say that. I scroll my social media and I constantly see hack your wealth, right? Those kinds of things. And as much as we might roll our eyes at that, there is some kind of relevance in meeting millennials where they are, right? Whether that's have the seminar at your bank or host a Twitter live thing, right? Or I guess X live, having that content for financial literacy and, education, to your point, Miles, on here's some offerings that we, are building to, kind of attract that. Meeting them where they are with content is definitely very huge, I think, for community banks these days. We had a question from the audience, and I was actually waiting to see when this one came up. So the younger generation, we talked a little bit about ChatGPT, but we're starting to look at AI tools for advice, right? Robo-advisors or, whatever that may be. How are you, and kind of both of you can answer this approach, how are you planning to work with and or around that concept?
Dave, I'll let you start, and then I'll try to.
I'm surprised that we got through 30 minutes before that question came up. So what's interesting is literally towards the end of last year, from Wealth Access's perspective, we were going through RFPs and banks were like, are you an AI company? And how do you think about AI? I think the pace that now where we're seeing banks, at least start to talk about it, it's moving at a pretty rapid pace. At our event a few weeks ago, we had 25 banks that were there, and about a third were trying to figure it out, and then the other third, and then some in the middle of the road, and the other third were like, our CEO just came back, and the most significant strategic investment in 2026 is around AI. And I think the AI, buzzword is obviously covers a lot of different things. But I think the question was really around, if next generation's starting to look to AI for tools for advice. If you think about ChatGPT or Copilot or, all the various tools that are out there, it absolutely is. And I think part of that is whether it's, and we had an employee that was using ChatGPT for a meal plan, or you're starting to figure out how, answers and not have to sort through a web page and have a bunch of ads. So it's certainly, moving at a very rapid pace. It's exciting to see at least what I'm seeing is a shift towards, from not doing anything to now starting to better understand it and eventually start to use that. And I think also it's keeping we started talking about digital, but it's also the human element of advice. And I think what banks have that, is a very significant advantage is the trust that they have. But if you're, so the question is, are you going to start to trust AI versus, your wealth advisor or your banker? I think that's still TBD, but the fact is a lot of people are actually using it. The adoption's going through the roof. So our take at Wealth Access is that, if you're using AI at times, it may hallucinate or it's a probability of an outcome, right? And so the most important thing to consider today is really around data. So the more accurate data and the more data, every possible financial element, both structured and unstructured data, is really important to have that first, and then to be able to leverage tools around that. We're starting to hear firms that are internally using Copilot and starting to take notes in meetings and have follow-up items. So we're very excited about it. We're starting to see a lot more activity in terms of banks, but I still think it's more trying to figure it out. The one piece of advice, we hear this, and I was just at an event a couple weeks ago in Philadelphia, and with the leadership of banks that were in the room, they're like, okay, we now want to do this, but we don't know where to start. And so it really starts around data and having the right policies in place. But I think the amount of data and productivity gains that can be picked up could be huge for the banking space and specifically for wealth management.
Yeah, David's spot on, and my take on using advice, I'll specifically hone in on that. You could use it today. You could type in a variety of different components and come up with a financial plan. The problem is with today's AI anyway, you have to ask the exact right questions to get the answer that you want. Because if you don't, it's not going to reconcile or true up. I mean, you're going to get a plan, even how to handle distributions in retirement, how you should cash flow that. You can put all that in there. But if you don't know the exact questions to ask, you're probably not going to get the answer right. That's number one. Number two is it always sounds good until the market takes a downturn. And then everybody starts to really have a lack of confidence in them doing it themselves and realizing that, hey, maybe I didn't do that. It's kind of like when you decide, hey, I'm going to go retile my own bathroom. I'm going to go to Home Depot and sit on one of those workshops, and you do it. And this would be if Miles did it. Then all of a sudden you lay it out and it looks horrible. It's a disaster. That's kind of what you're looking like here. Now, there are firms that are making large advances. Vanguard has just announced that, it's doing kind of a robo channel. And so it has guardrails and limits in there. I think you'll see more of that happening. But the more wealth that accumulates, people want conversations. And then it becomes beyond just managing money. It really becomes, how do I protect my children from this wealth? How do I make sure that my family values are distributed with this money? How do I have tax efficient, programs to make sure that I'm doing making the best options? There's still all those variables in there that you have to do. And if you're using financial planning software, most of them have Monte Carlo simulations that'll run 1,000 trials. I mean, you have to program in all of that information to get there. And I think most people just really want a simple outcome, and they want to have an engagement where they can ask questions. So I'm not saying it won't appeal to an audience, it will, but I think you're still going to see, particularly as wealth accumulates, that people are going to want an advisor.
Agree. And I think, especially thinking of those high net worth clients, right? There's still an emotional component that AI will never be able to touch, right? It's artificial intelligence for a reason. And I think, kind of to whoever asked that and everyone on the phone, of understanding what AI's strengths and limitations are. Because to your point, Miles, people are always going to want part of that human component. I mean, I know I don't go to a doctor unless I can submit the request online, but I want that person to call me to book the appointment. I just don't want to do it myself. And so there is those elements of, the human and understanding. You will always need that. So what's your strength in your humans, and then kind of outsource the weaknesses maybe to AI, like building the monthly review. That's kind of a time suck. I don't want to sit there and have to read through documents, but I want to know that data is there for me, right? So kind of thinking about lean into your strengths as a bank, outsource the weaknesses or the time consuming things to AI, to your point, Miles, of be the expert in the advice, not necessarily the kind of all the other stuff that you have to do that goes with it.
Now, I can't tell you how we're using it, and maybe that's part of this.
Yeah,
is how it gets there. So probably the biggest opportunity for all of us in every bank is actually penetrating our existing client base. And that's one, it's the cheapest acquisition cost. They've already got some affinity to you in your organization. And we're using AI to do that today. We call it next best product or next likely product. And so we're looking at a myriad of use cases or scenarios that are likely. It just pulls from our data, but it predicts clients that look like our wealth clients today. It goes into our entire database and said, hey, these clients look like this, but you don't have investments with them. And here are or you do, but here are likely products that you're missing. It could be insurance. It could be a variety. It could be depository, lending, and it'll tell us that. So it'll provide a lead for us to do that. And I think you're going to see more and more of that with financial institutions, is using data to be proactive and provide customization to the client so they don't have to go looking, for it themselves. It's not unlike if you pull up Amazon and, hey, you bought this product and, here are some more things you might consider, or Netflix, here's what you watched, and here are other shows you might like. I mean, it's the same thing with financial products, and that's available today.
I think
Go ahead, David.
I would just say part of that, it just in simple terms, it's around intelligence and productivity. If the human side of this, being the advisor, is able to access the information without having to, go through wills and trusts and statements and account balances and a lot of the data, there's a significant productivity gain, but it adds the level of intelligence, to provide advice, and I think for individuals to make more informed decisions. I mean, you hear about people that are going to see the doctor and they've already researched, their conditions and are able to have more or ask better questions. But my one piece of advice is for those that are considering AI and trying to think about it. As you're going into next year, it would just be to take one or two business cases and just focus on that. It's like AI eats the world. Like what in your day to day could you do? That's how we started our journey at Wealth Access. Is that I went to the team and said, what are the things that you're doing this week, and how could you apply AI? And report back the amount of time that you saved doing that. And it just started the journey of, getting people to understand AI a little bit better, but actually not just understand what it does, but how it could be useful in terms of their day-to-day and gain significant productivity.
Yeah, you guys are kind of in now this kind of strategic mode of thinking. Miles, you just gave a great example of kind of the lookalike, the algorithms you guys are building in. So, kind of, it's not about rewriting a playbook, but, kind of how do you leverage what you have existing and, doubling down, especially through tech and innovation, right? To your point, Miles, use what you have. So we had a question with this whole tech piece. How do smaller banks ensure that they have the technology or these types of things to compete, right? As millennials and Gen Zs become customers, you're a small bank, assumingly kind of small budgets. How do you get that tech to compete or to do the algorithms, right?
So, Dave, I mean, you're dealing a lot with the tech. I would just say, tech's one of those things. It's like buying a car. You can buy a Bentley or you can buy a Honda. I mean, there is way to get technology that you need without getting the Bentley version of trying to do it. And by the way, what all the money center mega banks are doing, they're doing it all in-house primarily because they've got the infrastructure and the scale, and they can do it. Most of the rest of us partner with other firms that do this full time, and there is a way to scale down that expense based on your need, in my opinion. But Dave sees a lot of this. I'm just talking from my perspective.
Yeah, I think part of that, to Miles's point, is to find a partner. There's a lot of technology and a lot of different things that are there, and a lot of, there was a survey that went out a couple months ago that was talking about a lot of the, core systems that are blocking innovation. Well, the reality is not every bank has Jamie Dimon's $17 billion technology budget. So how do you compete with banks that can do it themselves? Or we're actually starting to see some of the bigger banks even starting to partner as well. But it's more around figuring out from a business perspective, like, who do you want to be? What's the business want to do? And there's a lot of technology that's out there, but it's finding a partner that can really help to connect the dots. And banks have limited resources, tight budgets, and data is typically in silos. So how you're able to navigate through that, to continue to innovate, to compete with the big banks, that's, I think part of that is just finding the right partner or partners that can help you get there.
Yeah, there are ample partners out there for all asset-sized organizations. And technology has come down in price. I think it is democratized in that way. But I also know, as you're thinking about that, because I see a question about jumping straight to AI without data governance, and that is such a fire ready aim moment that your regulators will have a real issue with it. But you've got to have data governance. You've really got to plan. And AI isn't something that you have to rush and do right away. There is time to do this. I mean, we're still very nascent in the AI journey. All institutions are. And most are starting in the back room for efficiencies, not necessarily client facing. So there is time, but you've got to have that data governance and decide what it is that you really want to accomplish. And the chief risk officer is probably one of the toughest jobs in banking right now, between cyber and then use of AI and fraud and everything else. And so you really got to make sure as board members that you make sure that you have the right person sitting in that seat, because it's only going to become a more significant job if it's not already.
100%. That's what I was going to say. I've been in tech for probably 12 years, fintech, half of that. And I think that's the biggest piece of advice, is get a leader who can help you focus, and how to queue up all these different investments, right? And I'll read this question so it kind of makes sense of, what happens if you try to engage AI without improving access and quality to data? In other words, what happens if you try to leapfrog to escape data governance, which is really the unsexy part of infrastructure, right? And, we can talk, David, maybe a little bit more about that if you've seen that, but it is, if you have someone in-house who gets distracted or throws money at AI or these investments, that return is not going to be there. So what advice do you give, or how have you seen our clients maybe approach that of, kind of order of operations, right? What do you do now to set up for future? While, to your point, Miles, we've got the time, but the time is not 30 years from now. The time is also now.
Yeah, one of the first questions that we ask banks is, have you ever seen all of your own data in one place? And particularly with M&A continuing to pick up in multiple business lines, it's a challenge, right? You've got retail banking, you've got lending products, you've got commercial banking. And then within wealth, you may have multiple business lines there as well. You may have an RA, a trust business, brokerage business, self-directed. So I think playing around, or just focusing on the data governance, is have the right policies in place where your data is within your own four walls and you've got the right governance. But then it's also, and I think specifically with AI, Miles mentioned it, it's like you have to have the right data, so it has to be accurate. So, as simple as understanding what a household is, right? And maybe a trust account that has an EIN, or a beneficial interest to a business account, or, different types of individual accounts. I think part of it is just having the right governance in place, the right risk measurement, but then it's also getting the right data in place. And as far as, AI, our CTO coined this, said that large language models ate the world. You want to have a small language model, right? That, if you're using AI tools, it's within the right environment, and it's not being leapfrogged to a bunch of different tools and training other models, particularly around PII, right? You can't let that happen.
Yeah, Miles, I would love to hear, and we've talked several conversations probably a year ago about how you guys have really, kind of become one wealth, one bank. And this whole piece around data is not just on the wealth, unit to work on this stuff. How have you, partnered maybe with your consumer, your commercial, to make this a the data is a company-wide initiative. It's a bank-wide initiative, not just a wealth initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And it is cultural. And just for everybody's edification, we do run a line of business strategy. So three of us run, the majority of the revenue of the bank, commercial and wholesale and all the specialty lines associated with that, consumer, retail, and then me and wealth. And so we had been running a strategy in wealth management for about 10 years that I brought to the bank called One Wealth, which is really getting your broker dealer, trust and asset management group on the same page. Because depending on what door the client came in, historically in our business, they may get a different investment recommendation, they may get a different financial plan, and that was one of the big issues I saw in our industry. So I pulled that together. And then when our president and COO was putting together a blueprint for the company, and it really was fabulous. The one thing we did is kind of took that one wealth strategy into one bank. So we're all one, because if you think, all of us intersect each other's clients. So we really are concentric circles linked to each other. And so what everything that I do affects them and vice versa. So the three of us, and then the head of our technology and support systems is kind of our fourth musketeer linked with us. And so we're all tied together. So if we're talking about all the data and client journeys and working together, then we've got our technology and support partner aligned with us to do that. So what happens in most banks is you have somebody like me that goes to our tech folks, and then you have my other peers. They go separately to the tech folks. Before you know it, you've got 3 or 4 requests that may not complement each other. And if we would have just spent time together, then it's much more cohesive to do it that way. So it really is cultural more than it's got to start with cultural. It's got to start at the top. Instead of, whenever you run a line of business strategy, I mean, you can go 3 or 4 different ways and never meet in the middle. And that's the way most of them run. We made it a concerted effort that we were all joined at the hip. We were in it together, and everything we did, we were doing as a collective. And I think it's just the best way to run the organization, and it just makes for a clean running. It's a very collegial management group. We hold each other accountable, but we don't want to let each other down either. So that's where it starts. But you have to have singular data.
Would you say that kind of one culture is, maybe the strength of community bank versus, a large institution? Of why would a younger investor go with community over some of these larger, when it comes to wealth and where they put their investments?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll tell you outright the difference when you deal with a mega bank. So they have so many clients. They don't have literally enough people to go handle all those clients. So by design, they have to have either scaled up where you get a personal interaction, and they push more to the digital channels to scale. They have to do that way. And so really when you're dealing with the mid-cap regional banks, into the community banks, that is your secret sauce. You have those relationships. You are the fabric of the community. In fact, if you look at most commercial and middle market loans, they're done by regional and community banks. Mm-hmm. So, you already built into the fabric of that generation, and those people actually are there because they really want those personal engagements.
Yeah, that's something I'm starting to see as I'm settling into a community myself after moving around a lot, is the value of that. A question from the audience and especially at the community banking level, of alternatives to traditional investments like crypto with the younger generations, right? Have you guys seen that on both sides? And then as a community bank, how do you support something that traditionally a mega bank might be faster to get into?
So I'll make my answer short, and then David could do this. So it is definitely a hot topic, right? That's hit. And interestingly enough, some of my younger hires in my investment group several years ago wanted me to, make Bitcoin available and all of the crypto in particular and start putting it into client assets and things like that. I'm like, no way. Not until the regulators catch up with us, Congress catches up with us, because it wasn't that the generation wasn't ready. It's that the regulatory framework and frankly our custodians weren't ready because the regulatory framework wasn't there. The Genius Act changed all of that. Not perfect. There's still more things that need to be done there, but it has more or less legitimized. And now you see Morgan Stanley doing it. You see JP Morgan getting into it. Even though Jamie Dimon, said over and over again he doesn't like it, but it is an asset class. And so we're looking more into that now that there's actually regulatory support behind that. And absolutely millennial Gen Z, they're very comfortable with crypto assets. And maybe we'll do stablecoin for another show, but stablecoin for all of us in the banking world obviously has potential ramifications down the road.
David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can't speak for banks, but I would just mention one comment when we were in a conversation at our event, and I asked one of our bank clients who they viewed their biggest competition as, and he mentioned crypto. They were seeing outflows there. I don't know if that's the best thing to end on. So I'll go back to what we were saying or talking about earlier. I actually think that community banks, and because we're talking about millennials who are maybe purpose driven, to Miles's point, the advantage that community or regional banks have is how they support the local community and the relationships that they have, which, maybe that appeals to next generation to know that there's a purpose and they're supporting small businesses and individuals and really the local community as well.
Well, we're going to end on a high note because I do have one last question for both of you in the 3 minutes we have. What's one actionable step that leaders on this call can take tomorrow to move from awareness of this transfer to implementation of securing the next generation?
Yeah, Dave, I would say from my perspective, you don't have to boil the ocean. So you have to be aware of it and the conversations need to happen on this. The money is transferring. I would say check your staffing. And then what you stand for, again, we say it all the time and sometimes in the advertisements that if they're not rate driven, it's, hey, we're here, we're your local community bank. But I think it's got to go more directly to that client base with financial literacy and holding seminars and talking about wealth transfer and generations. Most of you have probably a trust department or trust light, as well as maybe financial advisors to hold those seminars and talk through it. But that's what I would do, is just kind of an easy next step. But everything we've thrown out to you isn't a rush and do. But I do think from the risk management standpoint, all these questions need to be asked right now. And I'll just emphasize your chief risk officer needs to be a really solid player.
David?
I agree with that. I was trying to think of one takeaway, but I think part of this is really around execution and empathy. So obviously, next generation having a digital ecosystem, but really, as you're thinking about it, to make sure that it feels human, and particularly around data. Next generation is still going to need advice. They're still going to need a bank. And so how do you start to communicate with them and engage with them? I think is important.
My 10 seconds of advice: get on TikTok, get on Instagram, get on ChatGPT, start to understand what's out there for us. Start your algorithm of financial literacy and see what's being presented and how you can take a unique community-based perspective on that. meet us where we are. I promise we're fun. Thank you, Miles, for taking the time, and David as well. Catherine, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
All right. Thank you guys so much for the conversation. Just a couple of last minute things here for our audience. As a reminder, you will receive the recorded version of this webinar within the next 24 hours. And we will also post this webinar on bankdirector.com so you can find it there. Thanks so much to the Wealth Access team for co-hosting today's webinar. And thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.